One of the problems that photographers often face when shooting images is the difference in the range of contrast between what we can see with our eyes and what our sensor can actually capture. I've got two sets of three images here. If we take a look at the first one, you can see that the center one of these three would probably be the best image if we wanted to capture detail in the sky. But of course it leaves the foreground and the main subject far too dark. We could turn to the one on the left, which is about midway between the two, but we also have the one on the right where the exposure in the foreground would give us far more latitude to make changes in Lightroom. Well, one of the options open to us is to combine all three of those into a high dynamic range image, often referred to simply as HDR. The idea with HDR images is we take a range of images, generally three, but it could be more than three or less, of course. But we try to make sure that we capture both detail in the shadows and also detail in the highlights. Then we combine the images into one, which gives us a very wide dynamic range to work with in Lightroom's Develop module. Let me show you how this works with these three images. I'm going to select all three from the Library module by holding the Control key, right-clicking, choose Photo Merge and HDR. It's always best to take the images from a tripod, but if we don't have a tripod to hand, take the usual precautions not to move too much, because the first option up here, which is ticked by default, is going to try to align the images, and generally it does a good job. I would suggest we can use or leave the auto tone ticked as well, because we're not tied to that. Once we open the image up in the Develop module, we can make changes, so we may as well let Lightroom make its best guess. The deghost, if we've got any ghosting with movement in the images, then I want my software to do the best it can, so I set the high setting, which probably slows down the process a little bit, but I'm more than happy to accept a slower but better process. And as you can see there, the image or the merged image has popped up on screen. If I go up to the auto tone, if I untick the box, well, there you can see the difference. But as I said a few moments ago, we're not tied to the changes that are being made, so we'll use this, if you like, as a default, as a preset, a starting point for our manipulations. Okay, I'm happy with what I see. I'm going to click to merge the two together. If you look up at the top left, you can see the HDR is being created, and in time Lightroom is going to create a fourth thumbnail of the church scene you can see top left there. The process on my old 10-year-old PC took probably just under 2 minutes, and there you can see the fourth thumbnail that's been created. What we can do now is move that image into the Develop module, because we've now got a HDR image with lots of dynamic range. We've got lots of options to create maybe an image with impact and appeal. The one thing you may notice about this image is that it's got very little color that's going to help us very much. So we could take the opportunity here, if we wished, to decide to make this a monochrome. I think it's going to come across much more dramatic as a mono, and we'll let the HDR process help to do that. One of the first problems we need to look for is chromatic aberration. So I'm going to ask Lightroom to show me the image 1:1, and I'm going to zoom in to the top there, and there you can see quite a strong cyan cast down the side, and there's also a little bit of magenta there too. So that's telling us really where we need to go first. So I'm going to tuck my basic tab away. We'll go down to the lens corrections and to the color options, and I'm going to tick to remove the chromatic aberration. It'll take just a couple of seconds to make the change, but there you can see it's done a fairly good job, but I can still see some there. Now, in normal circumstances, I find chromatic aberration works almost faultless 99 times out of 100. Here we are doing something a little different with HDR, so we may have to give it a little help. I'm going to move the green hue here towards the cyan colours up here. And then I'm going to drop the amount down while looking at the edge of that building. And can you see that's gradually being taken away? If I move that wholly to the right hand side, I think we get a much better result with the removal of all of the colour. I'm going to refit this on screen because what I'd also like to do is to have a look at the verticals, and we're in the right place for that. So if I go to my manual setting here, we've got the opportunity to make manual adjustments to straighten up the horizontals. But what I could also go to is the basic tab and use one of the auto settings here. For example, let's click auto, and that does a pretty good job. Let's try the full. Not too keen on that one. Let's look at just fixing the verticals. No, I think the auto has done the best job. Now if I turn it off, we'll just take a quick one more look at what it's done. We're not losing too much on the foreground because I wouldn't want to do that, but I think straightening up those converging verticals is going to help the image, so we'll live with that. Let's tuck the lens corrections away and go back to the basic tab. And I think if we are going to make this a monochrome, then perhaps the first thing we can do is just take the saturation completely off, and we'll begin our manipulations proper from here. The HDR settings has put some changes into the sliders here because we set that auto tone. But I want to push up the clarity. I think the image needs lots of that being a monochrome, and that's helped quite a lot. I think the exposure can come down even more to put a lot of drama into the picture. Certainly I think something like that. I also want to do something with the sky, but I think what I'm going to do is to use a graduated filter. Let's select the filter from the tab at the top or just above the basic options. And once we do, of course, we get all of the options that we can change show up on the right hand side. I can click and drag. Don't worry too much about what happens when you do this, because this has a habit of remembering the last settings. So I'm going to double click the shadows, which I don't want to change, and I want to drop down the exposure in the sky. Now I can put quite a bit of impact into that sky, but you can see that it badly affects the top of the building, so we'd need to do a bit of work there. How far down do we want to go? Well, I think some of these things are going to be purely personal, but I want plenty of drama in the sky. And sometimes I even choose to put a second graduated filter right at the top just to hold it in, and maybe even another at the bottom, just to give that darkness around the edge which forces our attention into the center of the frame. Now I'm going to click Done to commit those changes, but what I want to do next is to go and enlarge the image so I can just zoom into the top. And I'm going to use an adjustment brush to bring back some of the tones there. So let's select the brush from the just above the basic tab there, and down the bottom of this we do need to set the flow, the feather and the size. I think the feather's okay, the size, that looks good too, but I'm going to push the flow up to around about 10%. But the change I want to make is just more exposure, so I'm going to tweak that up, and we're just going to brush down the edge, and then we can make a judgment on how much change we've actually made. Not a great deal, as you can see. Now, to be able to make the changes that you can see as I paint onto the top of that church now, I've had to increase the flow to around about 50%, so that's okay. And I've also pushed up the shadows. But once I've got the changes set that I think is going to give me a result, Now I can just take the time to actually do the rest of this and take a bit of care going around the edge. The one thing we don't want is to overspill the edge. But remember, if you do, you always have the opportunity to edit what you've done with the brush so you can actually correct mistakes. Now, I don't think you need to watch me go around absolutely every part of this. Let me just drag this down to that chimney on the right hand side. Here I would be making my brush a little smaller, but I would be taking a bit of care to go down and just lifting the tones around there. Care and attention to detail is vitally important, and if you need to make your image larger and your brush smaller, then that's what we need to do. Now, once I've lifted the tones in the area at the top of the church so it looks natural, I'm going to click Done because I want to add another adjustment brush. The one weak point we have is a lightness coming through the sky on the left hand side, so perhaps that's the next option to deal with, on the next part of the image we have to deal with. And again, I think the brush is going to do this pretty well. Looking at the exposure, we want that the other way, so we certainly want less exposure, and maybe we want to drop the highlights down too. Now let's make the brush fairly big. I'm going to drop that flow a little bit just to start with. Let's try 30, just wipe across there and take a look at what it's going to do. You probably had difficulty seeing that, so it did change, but it indicates that I can push this up a bit more again. So let's try that again, couple of sweeps. There you can see the changes gradually being made. And I'm going to make these changes gradually because it's very easy to start painting over these areas, and if we're not careful, everything runs away with us. So I like to do one stroke at a time and make sure I'm happy with what I've done. Yes, we've got the history, we can always go back, but sometimes Lightroom can slow up a little bit, so there may be times when we may want to clear all of that history anyway. A little bit of lightness in the sky there, so I may sweep my brush across that area a couple of times, but I am sure you're well aware that lots of the changes I'm making here are more to do with personal taste rather than pure right or wrong. Clicking Done, I'm going to come away from that, and I think this is quite often where we need a short time out. In other words, where we put down the mouse, we sit back and we look at the image and we just make a decision on whether we've completed all of the work or we need to do a little more. Now, I was wondering whether I want to just tweak the exposure very slightly and maybe even the contrast. The clarity's well up, but maybe we could look at contrast as well. But sometimes when we pick up these sliders and move them, they sort of run away with us if we're not careful. So I'm going to double click to reset that. I'm going to put my cursor into the value box to the right, because once I do that, I can use my up and down arrows to make the changes I want to make. Now you can see I just clicked and held that and it went far too far and in the wrong direction. But there we are with +1. Let's come back to +90. There's where we started. So I'm just going to lift it a couple of times. Look at that, 20. It just gives it just that touch more sparkle, perhaps, maybe anything between 20 and 30. And I think I'll do something similar with the contrast, lifting it just up a little bit. We're moving in the right direction, but we're not seeing such a change that we saw before. But I can keep nudging this up until I feel I've gone about as far as I want to go, and that doesn't look too bad. One final thing I'd like to do to finish is just to put a radial filter onto the image. Let me select that. Whoops, got it. Go to the center of the screen, click and drag. So using the toggles around the edge, I can stretch my radial filter out until I get the size I want. We need to pay attention, of course, to the feather. That's the softness of the edge here. What I'm going to do is to just quickly double click these 3 sliders, or 2 sliders. So that takes us back to where we started from. what I'm going to do is just tweak down the exposure in the outer edge, but I think I'm going to do it with that option using the up and down arrows on my keyboard. As you can see, I've added about a -80, which just shades that edge and corners that little more, throwing the emphasis right onto the church, which is our main centre of interest. I'm going to click done, and there's our HDR image. Switching back to the library module, there you can see that we have the 3 images that made up our HDR along the top, and of course now we can compare them to the one we've created. I don't think the colour was doing us any good at all, so I think the monochrome was a good choice, and of course it suits not only the HDR process but also the content of the image.